through meditation, you get to realize that you tell yourself stories about reality. And you tell yourself stories about, oh, my relationship with so-and-so, when they said that, they thought this and they don't like me anymore. All these different things that we come up with in our stories. And through meditation, often we get to realize, actually, those are just by our own construction. The very notion of the self is something that we construct through our own mental activities. And by realizing that, it liberates us to open up to other possibilities.
Collective Insights is a voyage through topics and technologies revolutionizing human well-being. Groundbreaking approaches for a better world and a better life await you. Welcome to Collective Insights.
Hi, I'm Dr. Dan Stickler. Before we get into this week's episode, I wanted to share with you about a protocol I'm passionate about in my practice. Now, everyone wants to slow down aging, but most of us aren't sure how to do it the right way. And there's something that I recommend that everyone can do, and it takes just 2 days a month. It's a bodily cleanse that helps get rid of old defective cells, these cells we call senescent cells. They're shown to be related to so many symptoms of poor aging. This is something that all of us need to address as we age. This bodily cleanse is a supplement which contains a group of ingredients that we call senolytics. New research on aging and longevity, including a clinical study on Qualia senolytic, shows that senolytic supplementation can play a huge role in enhancing how we age. Senolytic ingredients help our body flush senescent cells, supporting repair and rejuvenation from muscles to joints to even how we feel every day. To learn more about senolytic research and to try Qualia senolytic risk-free for 100 days, go to qualialife.com/cells, that's CELLS, and use the code CELLS for an additional 15% off. Welcome to this week's episode of Collective Insights. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Stickler, and excited to have a special guest with us today. His name is Jeremy Lent. He is an author and speaker whose work investigates the underlying causes of our civilization's existential crisis and explores pathways towards a life-affirming future. His award-winning books, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, that was my introduction to Jeremy, and The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And this one was one that I just recently finished. This one traces the historical underpinnings and flaws of the dominant worldview and offers a foundation for an integrative worldview that could lead humanity to a flourishing future. He has written extensively about the vision of an ecological civilization and is the founder of the Deep Transformation Network, an online global community exploring pathways for a deep transformation toward a life-affirming future on a regenerated Earth. Thank you for joining us, Jeremy.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to this conversation with you, Dan.
Yeah, I have been looking forward to this for a while because, as you know, I reached out to you after reading Patterning Instinct, and then you guided me towards The Web of Meaning. And that has been certainly a transformational book for me, as was The Patterning Instinct. It gave me whole new perspectives that have helped me in my personal growth, for sure. But you weren't always an author in this way, were you?
That's right. Yeah, that's completely right, Dan. I spent the first half of my adult life basically in a very different place, actually, more in the world of business. Got an MBA at the University of Chicago, and I started actually one of the first internet companies during that first dot-com boom back in 1996, whatever it was. And I took a company public. It was the first company ever to allow people to apply in real time, get approved in real time for a credit card. And you could design your own card and drag your image into it. It was exciting stuff. And for a while, it was a successful company. And then I was also part of the dot-com crash, which caused me to go through a major life questioning kind of crucible of thinking through what I want the direction of my life to be. And that turned out to be a great blessing for me because it's really led me to the second part of my life, which has really been in a way, you could think of it as a search for meaning. There's two books that you just mentioned. They both have the word meaning in the title or subtitle. And I think that's been a very important part of my direction since then.
And it wasn't always an easy transition for you, was it?
That's right. That first period was really a crucible. In fact, my wife at the time, she got quite sick, and that was the reason I left the company too early. And that's when the company crashed, basically, that I had started. And then I spent years going through almost, it felt like a bit of a purgatory in terms of, even though she passed away about 10 years ago or so now, but she went through years of kind of borderline dementia where I felt I was looking after her, but also really alone in the world. And that caused me to really go through deep questions like, what am I doing here? And almost to a place of despair. But I kind of made this deep vow. I was going to not get stuck in those negative places, but find something that was truly meaningful. But the real vow I gave to myself that I wasn't going to just believe in something because it made me feel better. It had to be something that could be truly work in an integrative way, like really where my reason, my head could get into it and believe that it's from a rational perspective, but also where my heart and my spirit could feel really that this was meaningful. This was actually a life for it. That was really a driving point through what I sort of put together. And really where I went with that was kind of questioning core concepts that we just take for granted in our lives. Like whether those concepts are words like soul or spirit, or concepts like God, or what makes humanity separate from the rest of nature, or just these very basic things, trying to understand them really deeply. It involves almost like a little bit like peeling layers of an onion. Whatever recent concepts around that, what come before that? And so that went to a sort of almost a historical layering of going through modern ideas to then looking at deeper history, to ancient history, then to prehistory and cognitive history, which led to more or less evolutionary biology. And so it was a very interdisciplinary research project that I went through, which led me to write that first book, The Patenting Instinct, which is more of a historical sort of analysis of how different ways of meaning making all through history have actually shaped the course of history. But it that was part of my own exploration of like, how do we get to this place we are now? And this more recent book that you mentioned, The Web of Meaning, is really like a sequel to that first book, because it's a little bit like from a medical perspective, you could see the first one as being more like a diagnosis and the next one more like I don't want to say prescriptive because I don't like that term at all, but more like at least setting the framework for ways in which we can make sense of things, which kind of the book itself is structured according to these fundamental questions that basically every human asks at some point in their life, like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? Why am I? And how should I live? And in each case, it looks at how our dominant worldview gives us answers that are not only dangerous, leading us to this course of destruction, but just plain wrong, even from a scientific standpoint, in terms of looking at a more recent understanding of science. And to me, one of the great discoveries through this whole period of this research was recognizing at some point that these distinctions we make between what is scientific and what is spiritual, that is itself a false distinction that is part of this dominant worldview that doesn't actually have any true, real substance once you start to look at it more deeply.
Well, and to follow up on that, you're integrating this science, traditional wisdom, and philosophy in the web of meaning. Was there a specific instance maybe where these different perspectives converged and you had this sudden awakening of how they interrelate?
Well, there was one very interesting moment, actually, when I was, in fact, doing the research for this earlier book, The Patenting Instinct. Well, maybe just to back up a bit, as I first started to try to understand my own place in this universe and what we are, these bigger questions, really kind of started out from scratch, like sort of beginner's mind, if you will, which it truly was. And well, who are the people that we respect nowadays? And let me read them. So I read people like Richard Dawkins and The Selfish Gene, which was the standard book on his is what it's really about. Of course, Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene says basically we're all nothing but it's like a reductionist manifesto. We're just basically driven by our selfish genes. That's the way it is. If you don't like it, sorry, too bad. That's our reality. So I was ready to accept that if I needed to. But then I began to discover that there is another way of looking at things, which is more like systems-oriented understanding, which sort of Fritjof Capra is one of the great writers in that regard, but like a systems view of life. And a systems view of life basically means looking at the connectedness between things rather than just the things themselves. And I began to realize that real deep thinking in evolutionary biology, cognitive science, etc., also was looking at these connections. So that was very exciting to me as I was discovering this scientific approach. And at the same time, I was reading a lot of the early history. And there's a great scholar called Joseph Needham who wrote a series of books, basically about 20 different volumes, called Science and Civilization in China. And he looked at the early traditional thought processes in China around with Taoism and Confucianism and this amazing group of thinkers about 1,000 years ago we call Neo-Confucianists. But the incredibly interesting thing was that as I was looking at the scientific approach, one of the people I was reading was like Stuart Kauffman, who's a great thinker in complexity theory. And he writes books with titles like Our Place in the Universe or At Home in the Universe or whatever. And so in one of his books, he writes about how this approach to complexity science causes us to think, he goes like, we're entering new territory that no one has ever discovered before. And we need to ask new questions about what existence really is. And this is like brand new territory. And because his focus was on the connections between things. And at the same time, I was reading Joseph Needham writing about traditional Chinese thinkers and these Neo-Confucians who, for them, the very understanding of the universe was what they called Qi and Li. And Qi was the stuff that the universe is made of. And Li, they defined basically as the organizing principles that connected everything in the universe to cause these emergent manifestations of life, humanity, the world, etc. And I realized that what Stuart Kauffman was thinking had never been explored before, with the very ways of looking at those connections that had been explored by different cultural traditions much earlier in history. And to me, that became like a Rosetta Stone. It was like, wow, there is this realization that what modern science is leading us to is some of the great insights of traditional wisdom. And I think that was when something went off in my mind, like there's something here that has not been explored in nearly as much depth as we need to, as those deeper connections.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at it that people think of systems thinking and complexity thinking as arising in the 1920s. But when you do look back at ancient history, especially in the Eastern cultures, you can truly see that they understood things. Almost understanding concepts of quantum theory, quantum mechanics. It was quite impressive the way you put those together in the book.
Well, that's right. In fact, there is a group of early Buddhists called the Huayan school of Buddhism, whose whole approach to understanding life was pretty much, could almost transliterate it to words in which we describe quantum mechanics, because their view of reality was that the way in which reality itself exists only arises out of the way in which we as observers observe that reality. So the actual perspective we take to it affects the very reality itself. So to them, it made sense that there is no one objective sort of truth about the universe, but everything is based on how we relate to it, which is very consistent with the whole deeper Buddhist concept of dependent arising. Everything arises from as an emergent result of everything else around. But that almost describes the great discoveries of what quantum mechanics came across in the 1920s or so, that, is something a wave or a particle? Well, it depends on how you observe it, is what actually affects it. And that's a kind of a mind blower for our Western way of thinking. But I imagine a Huayan Buddhist would have said, well, of course. How can you not get that? We also have to be careful not to, I think, get too carried away by this in terms of imagining like there's a way in which obviously modern science applies a rigor and an understanding and a quantitative depth that those early traditions didn't apply. But I think the point is not to say, oh, wow, they had it all figured out. But the point is to say that there is great wisdom from approaches and deeper understandings that they had that we can learn from and apply as we look forward into how we can actually develop a more integrated worldview into the future.
Yeah, let's talk about worldviews for a second. In your books, you talk about root metaphors quite a bit and how we have this perception that we've created our worldview when in reality, culture has created the worldview for us.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think that most of us don't even realize that we have something called a worldview until somebody points it out. And we can imagine what a worldview basically is. We can sort of think of it almost like as a lens through which we see everything around us. And in just the same way that none of us realizes that we have a lens in our eye that actually sort of turns everything upside down from what is actually out there in the world, but we get used to it until we do our biology and when we discover that that's the case. Similarly, we don't realize that we actually see everything through a worldview, and the ways in which we make sense of things, the ways in which our core values emerge, things that we just take for granted, arise from that lens in which we see things. And discovering that has a very liberating potential, because really it's a little bit like in Buddhist practices. One of the reasons why Buddhists engage in deep meditation practice is because through meditation, you get to realize that you tell yourself stories about reality. And you tell yourself stories about, oh, my relationship with so-and-so, when they said that, they thought this and they don't like me anymore. All these different things that we come up with in our stories. And through meditation, often we get to realize, actually, those are just by our own construction. The very notion of the self is something that we construct through our own mental activities. And by realizing that, it liberates us to open up to other possibilities. Similarly with worldviews, once we realize that the worldview that we take for granted is just something that is culturally conditioned, and our own mind has been developed and neurally connected based on those conditions, it opens up the possibility to explore what are other worldviews and what does that mean for how we relate to our own lives and our future and our society. I think that's a very powerful and liberating path.
Speaking of that shift in worldviews or taking that new perspective, I think it was Daniel Quinn's book, Ishmael, that I read probably 25 years ago, that opened me up to the fact that there were different worldviews and different ways that we see things that others do not. I can remember we have 5 grown boys now. But remember, I asked them when they were probably around 12. They were going to church, and I said, do you think if you grew up in Iran that you would be a Christian? And they were all like, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there was not a bit of doubt about it in them.
Yeah, and that is actually really important and is crucial to understand how to reach out to different groups in our polarized world today, and to really understand how deeply feel people like take things for granted that maybe we should explore from a deeper place. And I noticed that you've recently been talking with Robert Sapolsky, great writer.
Yeah, quite the opposite conversation.
One of the things he actually says, which I think is a brilliant insight into this, is actually sort of when we get to our teens, in fact, that we, through socialization in those areas, we begin to sort of deeply start to feel our beliefs about things. And so one of his great insights is actually so our brains lead our intuition in that respect. Like what our culture tells us, as we grow up, we get to feel it deeply. So things like almost everybody in the developed world today might agree things like animal cruelty is wrong. And we just feel that so deeply. It's got to be just a truth. But that's actually these things are culturally conditioned, or that slavery is wrong. Again, nobody would have believed, very few people would have believed that was wrong a few hundred years ago. And now pretty much everyone does. Those are ways in which culture actually shapes not just worldviews from a rational perspective, but even our deeply felt gut instincts that we feel something just absolutely is right or wrong. So that's also very important to understand.
So you talk a lot about the being ecologically or having an ecological worldview. And what that brings up to me is that it is that thinking of that man versus nature rather than saying man as part of nature, or not seeing the holon within the holon of the entire earth, the cosmos, and our role in it. And people say, well, that's just getting too metaphysical, but it truly, if you looked at it from a scientific systems standpoint, it's completely logical.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think that is part of what I really tried to express in this book, The Web of Meaning, integrating science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe, is a lot of what we can easily be dismissed by mainstream people who are just used to reading more sort of mainstream literatures. Oh, that's all new agey. I don't go there. Like all woo kind of stuff. That actually, that notion of deep interconnectedness is absolutely hardcore, rigorous science. And there are all kinds of Nobel Prize-winning scientists writing in peer-reviewed scientific journals around complexity and systems thinking, and et cetera, whose actually worldview is based on this recognition of this deep interconnectedness of not just different disciplines, but interconnectedness between these false distinctions we make between like mind and body, or humans as something essentially different from the rest of nature, things like that, turn out to be just constructed and constructions based on false presumptions. Oftentimes they were made in 17th century or 18th century European thinkers that have been superseded, but they're so much part of our dominant way of thinking that when people come up with other alternatives, they tend to be dismissed. And there is a ton of New Age thinking that is very woo-woo and that loses that rigor and ends up in all kinds of places that I don't go myself at all, because my mind, my rational thinking won't accept that kind of stuff. But the point is, and that's where, like in this book, The Web of Meaning, virtually every paragraph is footnoted with at least one, sometimes two different sources that mostly come from peer-reviewed science, because the point is that there is a very rigorous and solid foundation for recognizing a deep interconnectedness and for recognizing the validity of some of these great wisdom tradition insights from Buddhism, Taoism, or indigenous thinkers, and how that relates to how we can make sense of the world going forward and using rigorous science.
Mm-hmm. Are we ever going to be able to get this into policy? I mean, what's it going to take to influence the policymakers?
Yeah, well, I think that's where, honestly, a lot of the scientists who are working on these areas can really make a big difference. And they are making a big difference in some regards. I mean, on the forefront, so you have, for example, a lot of climate science right now, or there's really like a whole sort of subdiscipline called earth science, which starts off from that basis of true interdisciplinary understanding and recognizing, really taking more of a systems approach to looking at where the earth is headed, and sort of breaks down the distinctions between what is social and cultural and actual geoscience, and recognizes how these things all interrelate to each other. So I think there's a lot of really good work being done on that. I think that what is really required is a lot of people who are still, who are sort of thought leaders, but still stuck in a lot of these reductionist preconceptions. And to my mind, what is really important is to try to open up people's minds to realizing when they are making a preconception or an implicit assumption that then colors what they're thinking about, rather than them really truly understanding what they're talking about. And it's quite surprising to notice that. And even in the scientific literature, like we're only too familiar nowadays with the polarization that takes place in the sort of global politics between, right wing and left wing, or whatever these polarized places might be. But even in science, we see a lot of this same kind of polarization. People like this, people who are like followers of Richard Dawkins, for example, who are as committed to Dawkins and his view of the selfish gene as the people they attack, like the sort of orthodox Christians are committed to believing in a God who created the world and the universe in 6 days or whatever. And when they come across articles, I've been on the receiving end of some of this, and I've seen others too, when they come across articles that get published that ask different questions and undermine some of their precepts, they get ad hominem, and they get down, and they'll absolutely be as vicious in their attacks as maybe a right-wing extremist will be on somebody that they view as being overly progressive or whatever. So I think that's what we need to overcome, is this kind of sense of my team or the other team, rather than like really trying to ask these deeper questions.
But a worldview can generally get even stronger the more evidence you provide to the other person. So what's the approach there?
Well, what is interesting, in fact, about that is, and studies have shown this, that the more educated and the higher IQ somebody has, the less open they are to getting their minds changed from arguments on the other side. So you'd think, a simple assessment would think the other way around. That, if somebody's smart, they'll be open to other arguments. But they use their intelligence to then construct more and more elaborate ways to push back the argument that they don't like. And I think that leads to a very important kind of point, that to the extent that we want to see this awareness of worldview shifting and move towards what I view much healthier future possibilities, is to approach people not just from the head, not just through sort of left hemisphere kind of logical arguments, and not from the point of view of like we're debating. I'm trying to persuade you that you're wrong. I'm going to show you that I'm right and you're wrong. But I think we need to approach people much more from the heart and look at the places where we do connect, look at the shared feelings, and lead really what I try to do in conversations like that. I'm not saying I'm always successful, but is to lead people to just in their own minds orient towards more curiosity. To my mind, the most successful conversation is not one where I sort of browbeat somebody into agreeing to some point, but where they walk away from the conversation curious about something that they had taken for granted, but actually wanting to explore a little bit more for themselves to start to ask more questions. To me, that's a wonderful place to go.
So this brings us to this future vision. And I've recommended your books to several of my friends. And I would say a couple of these friends are real polymaths or multi-potentialites, and will say, I love the book, but the rhetoric around we need to do something now. And one of my friends is like, he said, you know what the common thing is of all of these people that were saying, if we don't do something about this, that's going to be a catastrophe for life on Earth. And he said, the one thing that's consistent is it's never happened. And like you say in the book, they say, well, with greater and greater knowledge and our exponentially accelerating technology, we'll be able to fix all this stuff. So,
yeah, important questions. Yeah, I myself spent years going through this research. At first, I was approaching a lot of these sort of, you might call like eschatological sounding type approaches, like, that we're approaching the end of the world type kind of things, with the same kind of skepticism. And it's true that if you look historically, you can see sort of this millenarious type thinking all through the years. There's oftentimes people in the middle of Christianity 1,000 years ago, people say, when it's 1,000 years have gone, this is when the world is going to be ending, and whatever it might be. And well, lo and behold, the world didn't end. And you have cults now who believe some catastrophe going to happen, then it doesn't happen, and then they rationalize around that. And I think it's valuable for people to have a skeptical, questioning approach to those ideas. What I found was, as I did more and more of the research, was that there are many characteristics about our current civilization that is very different from anything that we see in history. I mean, from the biggest point of view, the biggest difference is that technology, cumulative power of the human race based on its technological abilities right now, has become so vast that really, to quote Earth scientists, this is not like, again, spiritual thinking. These are hardcore people who have spent their life studying the impacts that are taking place on the Earth. Humans have actually become one of the great geological forces of nature. And there are all kinds of numbers to back that up about just the impact that is being had on the Earth by human activity. And whether, the question of, have we moved from the Holocene, which was a nice kind of mild period of climate, to the Anthropocene? And there are sort of questions among geologists. There's been a pushback about saying it shouldn't actually be called a new era. But even the people who say it shouldn't be are saying it should be called an event, which from a geological standpoint has a huge impact. But the point is that there are many, many characteristics of how, as a result of human impact, we are entering a new period on Earth. And that's, for anyone who really wants to look at the science, there's really no real, I think, serious pushback to that idea. And once we recognize that, then the notions that if things might have been said before and falsely declared to be the case, but that the fact of that doesn't mean that it's not the case now, because we are in a unique place in the human impact on Earth. And so some things are clear, like civilizations have collapsed before, many times. In fact, every civilization at some point has collapsed, with a possible question of a traditional Chinese civilization, which kind of morphed rather than collapsing. But the point is that when they collapsed, there was a great simplification of what was previously a complex society. But then other civilizations took up the slack somewhere else. But right now we have a global civilization, which means that if this civilization were to undergo collapse, it really would be a momentous shift in the historical path of humanity. I mean, there are some people who say humanity themselves may be facing extinction. The only way I honestly see that happening is if we make the ridiculous mistake of creating a massive nuclear war, which obviously doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out how that could lead to extinction of humans and other species on Earth. Other than that extreme, I don't think human extinction is very likely in the near future, but I do think that the collapse of our complex modern civilization is a significant scenario that we need to explore. That doesn't mean that I don't agree with some people who think it's inevitable. I feel that is really a misreading of everything we've been talking about in this conversation. Looking at the world as a complex system recognizes the nonlinearity of how those systems interact. And nonlinearity leads to the realization it's very difficult to make precise predictions. So anyone who says, it's inevitable, we're going in that place, I feel is missing that, like, holding that complexity. It is, though, I think, an increasingly serious risk that this century we might hit that kind of place. And anyone who takes these kind of big picture notions seriously, I feel, has a moral obligation to recognize that serious risk and start to ask, well, and even if it's a small risk, and I feel it's not small, I feel it's quite significant, but even if it's a small risk, we need to ask ourselves collectively, what can we do to either to mitigate it as much as possible? And what can we do, even more than worrying about collapse, what can we do to move towards a future that could actually lead to the conditions that could allow human beings to flourish on a regenerated Earth? And again, scientists are very clear. We're headed for what's called the sixth extinction, which is basically, there's been 5 major extinction events on Earth since life began billions of years ago. And we are now at the starting points of creating that 6th extinction, as a result of our human activity. That leads to a deep loss of the richness and complexity of this beautiful world that we live on right now. And that itself, for somebody who cares about just the sort of quality of human life on this earth, I would imagine would be something to really have concerns about and want to explore what's possible to shift that.
I actually ran some of your statements through Consensus AI, and that one, it convinced me for sure that these things were real, that there are impending signs. And another thing I liked was your averaging about the fishermen seeing their initial catch of their generation as the average, so that they miss the larger overview of the loss of the fish.
Yes, and that's what tends to happen is like each generation, people like take for granted what they got to look at. And so just for anyone listening to this conversation, what that has to do with actually the size of cod that was caught in the Northeast, where it used to be 100 years ago, there'd be these massive, the average size of a fish would be massive. But each generation, people lose the awareness of what was normal before. There's a phrase to describe it called shifting baseline syndrome. And it happens in all different aspects of life. So people who are used to living in a very degenerated environment just take that for granted. They don't realize what they're missing. When we look at the richness and complexity of life on Earth, what is really interesting is to actually read some of the descriptions about oceans or about different parts of the world written by explorers, European explorers back in the 16th and 17th century. And then you begin to realize how much massive amounts of natural abundance has been lost. The estimates are that basically in most ecosystems across the world, about 90% of the abundance and richness of life has gone from when before humans started to impact the ecosystems around them. So that's a sense of like how much is already lost. But we don't realize that. We walk out into a forest somewhere, maybe on a vacation or going for a hike, and you feel, oh, how beautiful and serene nature is. And sometimes it feels very quiet. And we don't realize that actually hundreds of years ago, that scene might have been filled with noise and activity. We don't even realize what we're missing, basically.
Yeah, we see that in medicine as well, with the people not really paying attention to the fact that sperm counts have dropped 50% since 1980 worldwide. Testosterone levels, we just lowered the average on the test and made that the norm. It's really creating this normalizing of the current state. And, in medicine, and maybe you can kind of help me to understand this a little bit, but I practice a systems-based or complexity medicine. So I'm looking a lot at the interactions and the harmony of the system. And, you hear people talking about functional and integrative medicine, but I still watch that, and it's almost always more linear and reductionistic. They're trying to fix something, and you don't fix something in a complex adaptive system. You bring it back into harmony with the system. So anytime you're looking to fix it, you're taking the wrong approach to addressing the system. Would that be accurate?
I think it's completely right. Yes. Well said. Couldn't have said it clearer.
Yeah. There's a bunch of physicians and researchers in the systems-based healthcare, but it's a major uphill battle to get anyone to understand it. I know the Foresight Institute, I don't know if you ever saw their obesity map that they did back in 2007. And it was basically to address the obesity epidemic that was starting to happen in the UK. And after 4 years in 2011, it basically got scuttled because the policymakers couldn't understand it. And I think now with AI, we may be able to create something that will facilitate that understanding. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that any technological enhancement, including AI, has to be recognized as kind of an instrument of the context in which it's developed. And so I see the power of AI, the potential power for benefit. I think what we need to understand is that it's, for the most part, because of it's being developed by and for the same economic powers that have taken the world to this place where we're at right now. There's a danger that for all the potential benefits it can offer that people get excited by, that it also can offer even more dangers that really take these forces that I've been describing out already and almost take it to a whole other level. And I know that one of the key people in your whole series, Daniel Schmachtenberger, has really spoken very well about this notion. It's really like we have to look at these underlying, essentially there are underlying forces over the last 500 years that have led to some of the biggest existential issues we face as humanity right now, not just the things we've been talking about in terms of climate breakdown or ecological breakdown, but just massive inequalities and things like monolithic powers, like state and corporate powers in relation to this kind of human freedom, if you will. And we have to recognize that AI has the potential to exacerbate those disequilibria even greater. And I actually, there's a lot has been written about. It was more like a flurry of discussion when ChatGPT first became the sort of thing everyone was talking about a year or so ago, and has been less discussed more recently. But there is a real risk of, if we do actually develop a general AI, an advanced general intelligence that becomes like a superhuman intelligence, then we really have to ask ourselves this question about what's called the alignment problem. What about if this intelligence starts to try to optimize for something that doesn't actually relate to human well-being or the well-being of life on this planet? And one of my concerns really is that people who are thinking about that alignment problem haven't necessarily looked at the deeper underlying alignment problem that already exists between global systems and the flourishing of humanity and the flourishing of life on Earth already. So that's, to me, is something that I feel there's a lot of really deep exploration and discussion that needs to take place.
Yeah, I use AI a lot in my medical practice, and it's extremely helpful, but I also notice the bias to the reductionistic and linear thinking on it, to the point of I'm working with a project on a large human systems model that we can hopefully get out there to be utilized as an alternative. But with the current worldview that we have, it just seems like it's continually propagated in the younger generation because of all of the social media and the influencers. And how do we redefine success as not being monetary and fame to really focusing on relationships and meaning?
Well, I love the way you framed that question itself. Really begins to answer that, because that's the question that I feel like people need to be exploring and really in their own lives. And I mean, the first part of that is this recognition that is what social media is doing, is reinforcing these traits that are some of the most destructive traits, like that, and this reification of the individual, and the sense that status and economic status and prestige is what life is all about. And well, I feel that one of the most important things that any of us can do who sees that and are concerned about it is try to ensure that we are living our own lives on the basis of a different set of values that we might feel are more important. Values that, to my mind at least, begin with things like a sense of deep connectivity and a sense of, to really use a word that, again, can be dismissed by people as, it sounds like too new agey, but simple words like love, which I just define almost from the quasi-scientific places, the simple realization and embrace of our connectedness, and approach things with kindness, which is, again, is really like an expression of that connectedness. And if we can approach ourselves and others around us with really coming from those core values, then I feel that that is one of the biggest impacts we can have. Because just like I was saying before about people who won't change their minds by just being out-argued sort of thing, you have to like approach them from a deeper, more feeling place of connectivity. I think each of us can have an impact on shifting values of younger generations getting into all this stuff and getting them and themselves being conditioned by what they see around them, not just by what we're saying, but how we're expressing and what we're doing with our lives, an alternative. And I think that comes again back to that nonlinearity concept we were talking about earlier, that we need to recognize that each of us is part of this global system. It's not like each of us is separate observers seeing the system out there, that we are part of the system. And just as you were saying before, how modern reductionist medicine is wrong when it says, oh, we've got a problem, we need to fix that problem. They need to recognize that it's more about it's almost like around influencing a problem. You can recognize something is wrong and then ask yourself, how can I go about engaging with it as part of that system to help the system to realign to a more harmonious place? And I think that same thing applies in this case to that question you're asking, is how can we engage with people from coming from a quality of how we're engaging that allows other people to begin to notice something that's different, something that's a possible shift. And we never even know, it might be months or years later that somebody remembers a certain feeling tone, a certain way of responding to something that we might have been able to offer that then leads them onto their own path of re-engaging with some of those core values. So I think that really coming from ourselves, recognizing that each of us is part of that system and each of us has the potential to have an impact on moving that system towards a more harmonious path is really crucial to that.
Wow, that was beautiful. Yeah, that's a good way to close out on this podcast. So tell me about what's next for you.
Well, I mean, right now, I'm actually working on the sort of third book, if you will. You can always consider these books as part of a trilogy. And if that first book was looking at a diagnosis, how did humanity get to where we are now? And the second book was, what would a framework look like for more integrated worldview going forward? This book I'm working on right now actually starts to visualize and look at the specifics of what entire civilization could look like if it were to be based on that worldview of deep connectedness and recognition of deep interdependence. And a lot of people more and more are talking about this phrase that I got very excited about, called an ecological civilization. And the sense of like, what would it look like if we were to actually transform not just some of the more superficial aspects of our modern civilization, but the very foundations of the civilization. If we realize that our current civilization is built on kind of concepts like extraction and exploitation based on this worldview of separation that we've been discussing. But if we actually look at what would a civilization look like if it was to set the conditions for all beings to thrive on a regenerated Earth, that to me is a really exciting vision. And there's a famous quote by a critic called Frederick Jameson who said, "It's easier for more people to visualize the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism," which is so true. And really part of what I'm working on right now in this new book is to help people to visualize really like what could come after capitalism, something that is not just utopian, something that's actually based on what is ideas that are in place right now, things that are being done right now, but showing that you can weave it together for a more life-affirming future.
Yes. Thank you very much. And I want to close out with a quote from Antonio Damasio that you made in your book, "Nobody, never mind."
Thank you, Dan.
That was very good. So I have enjoyed this as much as I anticipated, and not more than when I first reached out. So thank you for your time. I look forward to connecting further in the future.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed the conversation, Dan.
All right. Thank you.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease, or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional, herbal, or homeopathic supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guests' qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.